Back, Senator Ketter.
Thank you very much, Mr Acting Deputy President. And I rise this afternoon to speak of this government's callous disregard for the people of my home state of Queensland. And, Mr Acting Deputy President, this is particularly in relation to the fact that this is a government which is denying to Queensland much-needed infrastructure investment. And in order to support that argument, I was interested to read in the Courier Mail today an article headed "Mining Boss Tells Abbott to Cough Up." And, Mr Acting Deputy President, in this rather extraordinary article, the CEO of the Queensland Resources Council, Mr Michael Roach, who is not generally known as being particularly a friend of the Labor Party, has indicated his support for the Treasurer of Queensland, Mr Curtis Pitt, and has indicated in this article that 100% I'm calling on the federal government to ensure that Queensland gets its fair share of infrastructure spending. Mr Acting Deputy President, regrettably, last month's federal budget saw this government deliver no new infrastructure funds for Queensland for any of our significant projects. And, Mr Acting Deputy President, when it comes to federal infrastructure funding, this government has let Queensland down very badly. We all know that with the tapering off of the mining investment pipeline, what most of Australia is desperately in need of is infrastructure for innovation, for collaboration, for improved productivity, so that the jobs of the future can be realised. But this government has sadly let Queensland down when it comes to this vital investment. In fact, Mr Roach has said that federal funding is being held back because the state would not take part in this government's ideological, and that's my word, asset recycling scheme. Now, we have had grave concerns about the asset recycling scheme for some time, and we know that the people of Queensland at the January state election have spoken quite decisively on this issue of the privatisation of state assets. Most people would be aware that probably one of the most significant issues in that particular election was on the question of whether or not the state's assets should be privatised. And the people of Queensland spoke quite emphatically that this was not to occur, and we saw the election of a state Labor government and the fall of the Newman government. But we in Labor know that this asset recycling proposition is a ideologically driven approach, and it is the people of Queensland that are suffering because of this ideological fixation that the government has on the question of privatisation of assets. I refer to the report of the Economics References Committee on the privatisation of state and territory assets and new infrastructure in March of 2015, and I quote, it refers to the issue of distortion of decisions. The committee has considered evidence that binding infrastructure funding with privatisation has the potential to distort state and territory decisions on privatisation and infrastructure funding. The potentially undesirable outcomes of this distortion may include privatisation of assets that would not otherwise be privatised, negative impact on states and territory revenues by selling revenue-earning assets to purchase loss-making infrastructure, and distorting the consideration of a range of more appropriate infrastructure funding mechanisms by states and territories. And it's very pleasing to see Mr Roach coming forward and saying in his comments that are reported in the Courier Mail today that, and I quote, "tying federal support to the sale of state-owned assets is redundant." So we have a situation in Queensland where I think we have a bipartisan position that the state election has determined the issue of privatisation of state assets, and despite the fact we have a federal government which is seeking to deny us the much-needed funding for job-creating infrastructure. The government's infrastructure funding policy is a joke. But I also want to give a more specific example of where this government has turned its back on the people of Queensland, and in particular the people of Central Queensland, in a most callous way. And I have previously spoken, Mr Acting Deputy President, on the issue of tropical cyclone Marcia, which in fact was categorised as a severe tropical cyclone. This cyclone crossed the Queensland coast north of Yeppoon as a Category 5 cyclone earlier this year, and it swept through Rockhampton and a number of other towns in the Central Queensland area. My home state of Queensland experienced extensive damage and disruption to communities, businesses, the environment and infrastructure. And I, Mr Acting Deputy President, saw the devastation firsthand in Rockhampton and Yeppoon when I visited the region earlier this year, and I want to pay tribute to the Mayor of Livingston, Mr Bill Ludwig, and the Mayor of Rockhampton, Margaret Strelo, for their attempts to try to secure appropriate support from this government for the recovery. And those communities have been hit very hard, Mr Acting Deputy President, by the impact of tropical cyclone Marcia. There's been a particular impact in the motel and hotel industries, and we've seen a number of those facilities closing down in recent times. And I would like to say at this point that you'll understand my dismay at learning that this government's refusal to pay its fair share of the Category D assistance under the Natural Disaster Relief and Recovery arrangements. The Queensland Government and the two local authorities that I referred to got together and came up with a sensible proposal to the federal government, where they, and it was a very detailed proposal for $198.5 million under the Category D Exceptional Circumstances funding. But on the 1st of June, the Prime Minister advised the Queensland Government that the government was only prepared to provide, on a cost-share basis, $27.75 million for Central Queensland. And in his letter, and quite insultingly, Mr Acting Deputy President, the Prime Minister said that the overall impact of tropical cyclone Marcia was not of an exceptional nature compared to other cyclones that have been experienced. And I'm sure that the people of Rockhampton and Yeppoon would strongly disagree with those comments. It was an exceptional event for them. The Queensland Agricultural Minister, Mr Byrne, has said that without full Category D assistance, major projects, including the Rockhampton Riverbank reconstruction and the Yeppoon foreshore revitalisation project, cannot go ahead. And Mr Byrne went on to say that Category D assistance is a safety net to support communities facing extraordinary recovery costs following a natural disaster, and a lifeline for the local economy that's still doing it tough. And I would join with Mr Byrne in saying that the federal government's decision is a real slap in the face to local families and businesses that have had their lives torn apart by an extreme natural disaster. This government has refused Central Queensland critical recovery funding, and I would go so far as to say, Mr Acting Deputy President, that this government has abandoned Central Queensland. And it's particularly disappointing to see the federal member for Capricornia, Ms Landry, failing to stand up for the region, and I call on Ms Landry to stand up for Capricornia and to support these local development projects. And I note that following the letter from the Prime Minister to the Queensland Government that I referred to, Ms Landry has welcomed that announcement, saying that $28 million would make a significant contribution to the recovery. That amount of money is simply not enough to get Central Queensland back on its feet. Rockhampton Mayor Margaret Strelo has said that Rockhampton alone needs at least $16 million. Mr Acting Deputy President, I'm deeply disappointed at this government's inability to stand up for rural and regional regional areas by refusing to allocate its fair share.
Thank you, Senator Kelly.